Hello, and welcome to another episode of Healthy Perspectives. My name is Vernon Solomon. This evening's episode is not particularly a fun episode, but it is one that addresses a topic that in some way has or will affect each of us, coping with the death or loss of a loved one. Have you or someone you know suffered a major loss? The truth is, when someone you love dies, feelings and attitudes may come up that you've never experienced or ever thought you would experience. You may even wonder if you'll ever feel normal again. Nonetheless, we can say after a loss that you will recover. Understand that we say recover, not forget. It should never be expected that you will forget persons you truly love. I have here with me again Koren Norton, and I welcome you, Koren. She's a social worker at Mount St. John's Hospital to help us address this topic of death, dying, loss, recovery. But before we really go into that, Koren, I want to show you something. Over the last few months, the newspaper articles, right? Perry Bay killing. Trio guilty of murder. 25-year-old gunned down at his place of employment. Teen charged with murder. A mother of 9 is killed in a road accident. The last 4 that I mentioned have all happened within the month of March. And these are the only articles that I literally just came across over the last day or so. And there's more. How are you as a social worker dealing with these incidents? They're coming through Mount St. John's, obviously the one hospital here on the island. How are families coping with such tragic loss that we're seeing almost on a daily basis?
Well, Vernon, it's definitely not easy. It's not a situation where the person has been ill for some time, so you sort of see a steady decline and you expect them to die. These losses are quite sudden, they're quite unexpected, and it's almost a blow to the person's psyche. I mean, you're talking to somebody one day, you're on the phone with them minutes ago, and all of a sudden you get a phone call saying that the person is no longer here. And what makes it worse is not just that the person the person has passed, but it's the circumstances under which it happens. That makes it the suddenness of it. It makes it extremely difficult for family members and friends who are left behind to cope.
What are you saying to them?
What can you say to them?
Exactly.
I mean, there are certain stages that people go through when they receive information like this.
Right.
And it depends a lot on the closeness, that, how close they were to the person. It depends on the method by which the person has passed. I mean, a tragic death leaves you angry.
Right.
Parents and family members become angry. Sometimes they're in shock. And as healthcare providers will tell you, when you have someone with a sudden death, you often have to treat family members. Persons get high blood pressure, sometimes they develop stroke, they deal with it in different ways. They collapse, they have anxiety and panic attacks. It's not something easy to deal with.
The one question that I think we hear more than anything that persons will ask, why? Why did this have to happen to my child, my husband, my mother, my sister, my cousin? Why? So if I'm grieving and I come to you because I've just had this tragic loss, my question is probably going to be, why did this happen?
Yes, and often there's no answer as to why it happened. If the person died because of an illness, it's easier to be able to use facts and to rationalize and say, okay, this was the condition that the person was suffering it. But when someone is hit by a car, there's no answer to why it happened. So there are things sometimes you talk to them and you say the person happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or sometimes you simply tell them we don't have any answers for this. But what is more important is how you cope with it after. You have to be honest with people. We can't pretend to have answers when there is none. When you have a 9-year-old who is murdered or a 13-year-old whose body is found floating, what answer can you give to a grieving parent who left their child at home? There is no answer to the why. What we do as best as possible is help them to cope going forward, because if we don't help them to cope, the backlash of that death could have such a far-reaching effect.
You mentioned at the outset stages. Are there various stages that these individuals would go through in the grieving process?
Well, different people grieve differently. depending again on the circumstances. But some of the common stages that persons go through, oftentimes there's denial. You call a parent and you said, I have something to tell you. I have to break the news to you about your son. That parent will say, no, not my son. And they might hang up the phone. And then you have to call and speak with another family member. So oftentimes there's denial. This cannot be happening. He left here fine this morning. He was walking. He was happy. It can't be happening. After the denial, sometimes you have anger. Whose fault is it? Why did this happen? They want to blame somebody because that relieves some of the pressure. We do have some persons suffering from depression. We have sometimes shock. Sometimes there's bargaining. I can't believe this is happening. If he would only come back to me. If she would only wake up. Lord, I promise I'll stop going to the casinos. I promise I'll go to church every week. But please, just let my child wake up. And we have parents who go through that bargaining process. We have some feeling guilt. If you have a mother who's carrying a child and she suddenly loses that child, no matter how much the doctors tell her it's not your fault, that mother feels a sense of responsibility. I'm the caregiver, I'm the mom, it was my job to take care of that baby, and that baby is gone. So sometimes that parent feels guilt. And the final stage, which we hope that all persons come to, is the stage of acceptance, where you recognize that the person is not coming back and you see how best you can continue with your life and preserve some positive memory.
We have to take a break, but when we come back, I'd like you to explain to me, you've listed the different stages, but is there a sequence that individuals will go through or not? Stay with us, we'll be right back. And welcome back. We're continuing our discussion this evening with Koren Norton of Mount St. John's. And Koren, just before the break, you were telling us about the various stages of grief. Now, that's easy to say that we have these multiple stages per se, but is it expected that people will go through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 in that sequence?
There's no order necessarily, it depends on the person, but usually in the first stages you usually have the denial and the shock. I mean, the shock comes when you first get the news. The denial again, when you first get the news, this can't be happening. So usually you have the denial or the shock earlier, and then the anger or the guilt comes a little after, when it's settled in that it's actually happened, and then you kind of need to be able to justify or rationalize it. That's when the guilt comes in, where you either blame yourself, or the anger where sometimes you turn it outward. The depression usually comes a little after, when reality sets in. He's really not coming back to me. I'm really not going to hear her laugh again. I'm not going to be able to see my child graduate. And that's when the depression comes. And the acceptance, of course, is the last stage, when the person usually feels a lot better and they've come to accept it. They don't forget. And we encourage people to, have memories in different ways. But the acceptance is usually the final stage.
And is it to say that each stage is going to last a day, 2 days, 3 days, a year?
There's no timeline. And quite often, when we're dealing with family members and we do a counseling session, we usually have to ask them to not put each other on a timeline. I've had persons call in saying, somebody said to them, look, it's time you get over it. And that's painful. It's painful for you to tell somebody it's time you get over it, because everybody grieves differently. However, if you realize that a reasonable, again, that's in quotes, time has passed and the person is still depressed, or it's affecting their functioning, their daily living, at that point you might want to refer them for professional help.
You've raised two issues that are of particular interest. One, do we find that most people do not know what to say to an individual that has gone through this tragic loss, or they say something that is in fact hurtful?
Yes, many persons, even trained professionals sometimes you're at a loss for words because it's so unexpected and you feel the pain. You feel the pain for the family. And there are times when even as a professional, there's not much you can say. You can sympathize or empathize. You can offer a hug, a touch, a glass of water, but there are times there are no words, depending on the situation.
And sometimes it's not that the person may necessarily need a word.
Sometimes they don't need words because you might say the wrong thing. For example, didn't you see this coming? You knew he was running with the wrong crowd, so what did you expect? Or oh, you'll get another baby, it's okay, things like that. It's going to be okay soon, don't worry. And people mean well. When people say these things, that's their way of trying to help. But sometimes we have to be careful that we don't do more harm than good.
Which is really an interesting point, because the truth is although we mean well, sometimes silence can be the best thing so as not to say something that is more hurtful.
Yes, definitely. And sometimes we encourage persons that, instead of saying things, sometimes you can leave a pamphlet there, the person can read it, at their leisure. There are times you can bring over a pot of rice, a casserole, some juice. That way the person doesn't have to worry so much about doing these things. You can offer to give them a ride to the funeral home. So when there are no words, we can show care by our actions, and there's so many other ways of supporting the person who is bereaved.
And you're right, sometimes it's not what the family or friends can do, but the individual may need to seek professional assistance. Yes. What are some of the things and or advice that a professional may give to the bereaved individual or family?
Okay. First of all, sometimes we have a pamphlet and we give it to the person for them to read when they're able. And it has information like contacting lawyers, contacting Social Security, these type of concrete things that a person needs to be aware of. But we give it to them so they don't read it at the time, because at the time it's all about their heart. It's all about healing. It's all about being able to get through a day or a night without your loved one. And when we give them that concrete information, when they're ready, they can look at it and say, okay, I need to contact the lawyers, I need to call the bank, I need to get, these sort of things done. But initially, we ask that somebody just stay with them, at least for the first couple of days, so they're not alone. Give them some space. I mean, they can be in their room, but it's nice to have somebody there, because we do have persons who become suicidal or they don't practice self-care. Their appetite changes, their sleeping habits change, and all these things need to be monitored.
And having the individual there, family, friend, being able to talk about it. I recognize that sometimes they may not want to talk about it, but is it good for them to actually talk through their emotions?
When they're ready. Initially, some persons might not want to talk. Again, it's a matter of personality. And you need to give them the space. People need to grieve in their own way. And we have to allow them that. Something has already been taken from them. We can't now come and take their autonomy. So we allow them to grieve in their own way, and if we notice after an extended period the person is not engaging in self-care, they're not washing themselves, they're not paying attention to hygiene, they're not taking care of the younger children in the home, they're not eating or sleeping, and it's affecting them mentally or physically, well, then we refer them for professional help.
Okay, excellent. When we come back, what I'd like you to do is address a few more specifics that we may be able to, or how we may be able to help these individuals that have suffered loss. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back. We're still here with Koren, and thank you very much for continuing this conversation, Koren. I know it's not always an easy topic to either listen to or even to talk about itself, But you were giving some advice, professional advice. We were saying when the individual is ready to talk through their feelings. What about writing it down? Is that ever considered an option for individuals who may not want to necessarily talk, but need to get the emotions out?
Yes, we use different methodologies. Sometimes it depends on the age too. If you have young persons who've lost their parents, they might not be inclined to express themselves verbally. So you can have them do artwork, and that helps them to express it. And you would find young children drawing pictures of their parents holding hands. There are times you would have teenagers writing goodbye letters to their family members or to a boyfriend or something like that. That usually helps because you remember the person did not get a chance to say goodbye. And they need that closure. And because a lot of these violent deaths, they become police issues and they drag on and on and on. That makes a trauma sometimes, it's like a fresh scar. It's like a wound that doesn't heal. So you ask the person, write a letter to your loved one because they have to find their own closure.
But now talking about closure in that same aspect, there are some people, since you mentioned child, that would say, well, you probably shouldn't take the child to the funeral ceremony. Would you say that the child should or should not go?
For every case we've dealt with, we always sit with the children before and talk with them, and most of the times the children go. The worst thing you want is for somebody 2 or 3 years after to have so many regrets. There's so many times when a spouse dies and the surviving spouse would say, I can't bear to say goodbye. And of course we listen to them and so on, but eventually as it comes closer to the time, we say to them, listen, you know, put something nice on him, his favorite suit, put something that he would have loved there, and say goodbye because, you know, you're worth it, he's worth it, and they're happy that they did. Because if they don't, oftentimes they would have some regret, and it would always be an unanswered question in their mind. What could I have done? What should I have done? And sometimes that goodbye letter goes with the person.
You know, this goes without saying that many times, most times when there's a tragic loss, there are tears. It's natural. But then you have the individuals to say, oh, stop crying, it's going to be okay, don't cry, and oh, you're a man, you need to suck it up and not cry. Is it okay to cry?
Of course, it's okay to cry. Again, sometimes we have the tragic loss of a child, and oftentimes men and women grieve differently. And what we see happening sometimes is everybody focuses on the mother, right? And because the father might not be throwing himself on the ground or shedding visible tears, that does not mean his heart is not breaking. So we have to understand and we have to pay attention to every person. We go into a home and we gravitate towards the one who really seems to be falling apart. But there are some people who are silent sufferers. And you know something, Vernon? Sometimes we have to pay special attention to them. When somebody expresses themselves, there's a certain release of tension. When you cry, when you lean on people, when you know. But then the person who's sitting there internalizing everything, it's like a pressure cooker. And you know what happens when it gets too hot? So we need to pay attention to the different persons and maybe pay special attention to the ones who don't seem to be outwardly expressing grief. Exactly. Because when grief turns inward, it could be very destructive.
And that's a whole nother segment or episode
Yes,
that we can
definitely.
actually then talk about. So when it comes to the mourning, the grief, people should understand that it's okay to mourn. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to cry. And also it reaches a point where it's okay to get back into
the normal routine. And that's a very important part. One other thing we have to pay attention to, there are times when somebody is newly deceased, their family members speak of them as if they're still there. In the early stages, you just allow them. They'll say, oh my, and they'll leave a plate there for him, and he's feeling cold. You know, they see the person lying there. How could you have him lying there in the cold? You need to put a blanket on him. What I would suggest we do as caregivers, put the blanket on that person for the time being. For the first couple of days, you need to just focus on the person and their healing. After a while, you do expect them to go back into their normal routine, and that helps some persons. They take baby steps, and the persons who work with them, who live with them, have to be supportive. Do not make the questions too intrusive. Some things you just don't need to know. You know, if you work with somebody and they're coming back to work after a loss, give them some space. You can leave a note on their desk, I'm thinking of you, a Bible text if the person is so inclined, a flower, and allow them to reach out to you as they need to. Do you need me? I'm here for you. Give them some space and allow them to recover, and they know you're there for them.
Children are a special breed on their own, and they deal with things differently. But sometimes parents try to hide the grief that they may be feeling from that child. Is that okay?
Parents have a natural urge to protect their children. And if you have a newspaper with the deceased with blood splattered, that is not something that you would want the children to see, because that memory will stay with them for a long time. You want them to remember their parent whole and in a way that they can have pleasant memories. So certain types of pictures and things on the television, children, it's appropriate to protect them from if it will sully and damage their memory. But grieving together is a positive thing. It helps to build stronger bonds. And those who are left behind can support each other. The hug from a child to a mom who lost her husband is precious. You know, and we have situations where sometimes the children get together and they do things to help their mother recover. Young children, okay, I'll make breakfast for mom. You know, I'll come and wash the dishes so mom doesn't have to. And that's a wonderful thing, because it means they understand what their mom is going through. And because in many situations, children might be a little more resilient. And after 2 or 3 days, they might be back out playing with their friends. For mom, it might be a little more different because this was her life partner. So it's great when they can grieve together and grow together and recover together.
Thank you so much, Koren. I think we'll have this conversation and more conversations like this again in the very near future. You'll come back again, right?
Definitely, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Stay with us. We'll be right back. It is understood that grief or suffering loss is shared with intense emotional pain. The solace we may have is that recovery is possible. However, recovering from grief may take a long time. Just as a severe physical wound takes time to heal, so it is with bereavement. But the sharp pain you feel in the beginning will lessen in time and will gradually seem less bleak and meaningless. Grief is said to be a necessary part of the healing process and of learning to adapt to the new situation. There's an empty space where before there was a living family member or close friend. We need to adjust to life without that person. Please remember, though, that not everyone grieves in exactly the same way. One thing does remain constant. Repressing your grief can be harmful mentally, emotionally, and physically. So, talk through your pain. Write it down, cry, work through the grief. It does take patience because you may feel that you are on an emotional roller coaster. Remember that you do not have to be ashamed of your tears. Shedding tears of grief is a normal and necessary part of the healing process. Please take care of yourselves. Be safe. We thank you for spending some time with us and for allowing us to share healthy perspectives with you. Be well, Antigua and Barbuda, and may your perspective always be a healthy one.
Healthy Perspectives, an AUA ABS initiative offering you a positive view on health.